you created some visuals with the jet order.
Well, this was the rendering at the time, and we wanted very much for it to be people places, and there were different groups in the neighborhood, East Cambridge neighborhood, Portuguese, Italian, Polish, and there was one particular family that was very much into soccer, so you'll see there's a soccer player in the foreground. But we wanted to show that it was open to everybody. And ideally, this would have had more restaurants around it, but I realize now that in years to come, the next generation, more restaurants were open. But you see housing on the right, office in the distance, and in the historic cupola you see in the background is the historic Bullfinch building, which was slated to be demolished at the time by the county.
The courthouse.
The courthouse, which Graham Gunn and his office has restored and have their own architectural practice in it. And this rendering, actually, we raised it out of the ground 30 feet so it would be more prominent. And that was one of the goals, you can turn on to the next one, of revitalizing the canal, was to make the courthouse much more prominently located. This was the way it looked in 1976, and actually up until around 1980, was garbage filled and pretty desolate. In the background you can barely make out, but it's the MBTA line to Lechmere train station. And this is a view of the same canal. It was approximately 10 years later, a little more. The edge that I showed you previously in disarray is in the upper portion, just behind the fountain. The fountain goes as high as 60 feet, depending on the wind. You can see the shopping complex, office, ground floor retail in the foreground, and this is taken from the apartments. It's very exciting, the transformation. I always imagined that Harvard Square was the dynamic center of the city. The river was sort of the heart of the city, much like Central Park in New York, and the Lechmere Canal would be the third sort of interesting, different space.
Yeah, and actually the right to the right of the jet d'eau is probably one of the only places where you can eat on the border of the Charles River without having cars in front of you.
Yes.
So you can get your food at the food court, and then you bring it out, and you actually have a lovely place to sit and eat.
One of my favorite days, my office is near here, it's on 3rd Street, not far away. One of my favorite things to do in good weather is to come here at lunch and literally watch people from the neighborhood, meet people who are working, meet people who are shopping, and even boaters coming in, moor their boat, and have lunch on the side.
Yeah.
And it's a very dynamic, in fact, this day, when I took this picture, that was the case.
Yeah. This is a picture that is nearby, and a space that was actually threatened to be destroyed.
That's right. All the buildings in this picture were going to come down for a parking garage extension to the county tower. Part of the plan that I spoke about, the East Cambridge Riverfront plan, was to save these buildings. It was a priority of the neighborhood, a priority of the city. And as I mentioned earlier, Graham Gunn's office took on this project. Later on, we closed Otis Street, which I realize in this image looks like it's still there between the buildings in the distance. And that street was closed and is now a park as well. So the finger from the canal comes a block and a half up to this point. It's a wonderful meeting ground for the neighborhood.
We've seen several, of the tools you use. You have the model blocks, then you have your sketches, and you have the before and after. And the next picture is also a before, and just to give a sense of the vastness of the parking area, of the industrial buildings. And
there were 7 acres of parking, as I recall, in the middle of the 40 acres. Most of it was Lechmere, as you can see. And that view is now this view.
Yeah.
It's the front entrance to the Galleria as you're driving on Land Boulevard, Old Commercial Avenue. It's Charles Park. So as I said, the 13 acres of open space became the framework for the new development. In this case, Charles Park is also the courtyard that announces the Galleria Arcade, which is part of that open space system. It's at grade and connects through to Lechmere Canal's fountain.
Yeah. Maybe it would be helpful for you to kind of summarize what was the vision, what were the underlying principles that guided you in this plan, which really has been an amazing transformation of East Cambridge. And I think as a citizen of Cambridge, we are very grateful that your vision came into there to create that. Give us a sense of what your principles were there.
Well, there are a number, but the highlights would be to encourage development in a positive way. Some of the property lines went through Charles Park following the old canal line in such a way as there would never be coordinated development. There were junkyards buildings on the Lechmere Canal. There was a men's massage parlor. These uses, in fact, the banks turned down Hotel Sinesta's wish to build a new building back in the 70s. So we had to change the image of this end of town, and with the city's blessing, we did that with the public open spaces, the plan we looked at earlier, making the transportation more coherent, including a new train station at Lechmere, and setting up guidelines so that each developer of their own land knew what was going to happen next to them. And initially, quite frankly, they didn't believe that was going to happen. But over time they did. In fact, the previous developers who had developed a building were the strongest defenders of the plan because they realized that what they built encouraged something to happen next door and next door. And good urban design is when all the buildings work better together than individually. Usually people, when a building is built, they go, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And they don't coordinate. We see samples of that perhaps around other cities and even in Cambridge. But here, each building that got built made the whole better and stronger.
Yeah, and there were elements incorporated that now, even as those buildings have uses more interesting, is that the city required that the property owners then maintain the public spaces, which is so important because a building is not finished when the brick and mortar is there. Then you need to maintain it, and the public spaces need to be clean and attractive.
That's absolutely right, and that, I think, is probably the thing that satisfies me the most, because the owners of the buildings are basically the benefactors now, maintaining Lechmere Canal, maintaining the fountain, building this park that we just showed, Charles Park, building and maintaining it. In the end, the developers actually built the parks as part of the system. So they, in the beginning, maybe didn't understand the connection between the open spaces and the parks, or providing the shuttle service that you have on the slide in front of you. It was a condition of the Galleria. Initially, people thought that might not be heavily used, but within a few years, more than 500,000 people were using this shuttle. And elderly people from other neighborhoods. It was very exciting, and the Galleria realizes it's a major asset.
Yeah.
None of this would have happened, I really believe, without documenting what we just showed you into a plan, the East Cambridge Riverfront Plan. And I'm proud to say it was the first plan put together professionally in a publication, and we went into great detail of what was expected, what was needed. And out of this plan, in part because of the document and all the work we did, the federal government gave Cambridge the highest urban development action grant at the time in the 70s per capita, almost $7 million, and then succeeding grants. And that's what paid for the public improvements. I think it's absolutely the best way to foster development in any city is you come in with the right kinds of public spaces that are thought out so they encourage development, and you do them. And this is a practice that was done in Europe and other countries many, many years ago, before World War II, and we should be doing it again. But the city allowing us to put this together led to $25 million of public funds that incentivize the development that we just looked at.
And what a difference it makes. Maybe we only have a few minutes left, but maybe we can go to North Point, and the area, we have a picture from the 70s looking over North Point towards downtown.
That's right. The Lechmere Canal is on the right of the raised bridge. The Lechmere Canal and the MBTA is at the lower middle, and North Point is on the left. In fact, you can even see the airport in the upper left, or barely make it out. And this was the original plan of North Point that was done by the city. I was happy to be the principal author. And this North Point, there was 70 acres approximately of land that really was a true no man's land, largely owned by the railroads, but in some other entities, including the state and the MBTA. And we looked at, and I think this is an important point, looked at a scheme that maximized development at a human scale with a connective open space system throughout, much like we did in East Cambridge. Along the river, it's fairly thin, and we saw it more as a pass-through with the focus at the circular knuckle there at the lower right portion, just behind the Museum of Science. But what we wanted was to make sure that we had enough room for development, quite frankly, to screen the highway that you see at the upper right-hand corner. Unfortunately, the way it's developed with a much larger open space, there won't be enough development to screen the highway. So it's really important to look at what you have and try to address it in a balanced way to make sure not only have informal means of people overseeing the parkland, but screening it if necessary, defining it. In this scheme, we now have two renderings after it. One is the circular space that I just mentioned with the bridge, the Museum of Science, sort of a public space defining at the park's knuckle. And the second is following a main street back to the MBTA station that was planned. And I'll show you next an image of the original MBTA station right there. So the notion was to have this connective public street that connected both halves of North Point. And unfortunately, this didn't happen. The developers stepped forward and said they would do it on their own. There was less public funding. The Urban Development Action grants were taken away. And even though there's some good development out there, the connectivity between the pieces is missing. And I think the public goals of screening the highway are missing. And so that vision was lost. But it's still a positive piece of the reclamation of the whole East Cambridge riverfront. And hopefully we'll get a T station much like this. This is a small T station. It would be at the end of First Street. It would pretty much terminate on that and could help enormously to the area.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our show, talking about the parklands, and just to hear you talk about the planning is really very exciting, because it really shows with the result of the Lechmere area what it means if you really plan carefully. And we know there's a lot of planning still going on in Cambridge and in other parts along the river. And I want to thank you for your vision and to sharing your vision with us today. And if you missed the show and you just joined us, this show will then go on to YouTube at the Charles River Conservancy, where you can see it and look at those plans in more detail. And the last image will also include the information of where you can find the Conservancy's website and Dennis Carlone's contact information. So I want to thank you for coming today to this show.
It was my pleasure, and I thank you for everything you do for the Charles River and all the communities around it. That's why I'm here. It's desperately needed, and a public voice is very important.
Good. So you provided the bones, and we continue your great work. Thank you very much, Dennis.
Thank you.